Chapter 25 of Stories of Old Greece and Rome by Emily Kipp Baker. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25 Perseus. When the wicked king Danaus persuaded his daughters to kill their husbands on their wedding night, there was one, Hypermnestra, who refused to slay her lover, and by saving him brought upon the head of cruel Danaus the doom that he had striven to escape. The grandson of Hypermnestra and Lynceus was Acrisius, king of Argo, a kindly ruler who dearly loved his only daughter Danae, and kept her always near him to delight his eyes with her great beauty. Unfortunately, the king chanced to learn from an oracle that he would one day be killed by his grandson, and hoping to prevent this, he shut Danae in a high brazen tower which no one was allowed to enter on pain of death. He placed around the tower a strong guard, so that no one could get even a glimpse of the imprisoned princess; but though no mortal wooer could approach her, Danae's loveliness was not hidden from Jupiter's eyes, and as he looked down from high Olympus he pitied the maiden's loneliness and loved her for her great beauty. Fearing to frighten her if he assumed any mortal disguise, and not daring to appear before her in his divine splendor, he took the form of a golden shower which fell softly on the sill of the tower window and charmed the lonely captive with its brightness. Each day this strange visitor came to glorify her darkened room, and Danae looked forward eagerly to its appearance. Thus, by means of the golden shower, Jupiter won the maiden's confidence and love, and spent many hours with her in the high tower room. Danae was not lonely any more, but people who passed beneath her window could hear her singing to herself all day long. One morning the astonished attendants rushed to King Acrisius and told him that in the brazen tower was a mother and child. His daughter Danae had given birth to a son, who was so beautiful that they called him Perseus. The king was enraged at this news and threatened to put the boy to death, but as he was unwilling to stain his hands with the blood of his grandson, even though his grandson might cause his own death, he put Danae and her infant in a cask and set them adrift on the sea. For days the strange boat tossed about on the ever rocking waves, and the poor frightened mother prayed to the gods to save her and her hapless child. Jupiter heard her cries, and no storms came to beat the frail boat upon the rocks, nor did any rough seas imperil the voyager's safety. At last the cask was washed gently up on the shores of the island of Seriphus, where a friendly fisherman rescued Danae and her child and took them to the king Polydectes. This ruler received them kindly, and allowed them to live at his court, and here the young Perseus grew up into manhood, learning all the games and sports that belong to the training of a Grecian youth. Meanwhile Polydectes had become so enamored of Danae that he wished to marry her, and grew very angry at her continued refusals. His wrath was increased when Perseus forbade him to distress Danae any longer with his unwelcome attentions. As Polydectes did not dare to kill Perseus or banish him from the kingdom, for he knew that his suit would then be hopeless, he began to taunt the youth with his inexperience, and asked him why he did not set out on some adventure to prove his mettle like other heroes. Perseus did not consider himself a hero, but he hoped some day to do great things, and the sneers of the king worked on his proud heart, as that wily old monarch had expected. The youth then demanded to have his courage and endurance put to the test, and Polydectes promptly told him to go and slay the Gorgon Medusa, and bring her head back as proof of his valor. Perseus needed no urging to set out at once, though he knew well the danger of the undertaking. His mother implored him to remain with her, but the youth was determined not to endure Polydectes' taunts any longer, and he was eager to prove his bravery, even at the risk of his life. There were 3 of the Gorgons, all of them hideous to behold, but Medusa was by far the most terrible, for besides her frightful appearance, she had the power to turn those who looked at her into stone. She was once a beautiful maiden, who had had the misfortune to offend Minerva, and that goddess, to punish her, changed her into a dragon-like creature with long tusks, a scaly hide, brazen claws, and instead of hair a writhing mass of snakes. To this monster Polydectes sent the young Perseus, feeling sure that he would never return home alive. The young hero had not journeyed far before he noticed that some one was walking beside him, and turning to look more closely at the stranger, he was at once surprised and frightened at recognizing Mercury. But the messenger of the gods bade him have no fear, for he himself had come to help in the perilous quest for the Gorgon's head. Then Mercury lent Perseus his own winged sandals, and told the youth that he would have to do some swift moving in the course of his adventures. The god also lent him a magic helmet that rendered the wearer invisible, and bade him offer thanks to Pluto as the sender of this invaluable gift. Not to be outdone by the other gods in kindness, the august Minerva lent Perseus her shield, the terrible Aegis of Jupiter, which the warrior goddess carried with her to battle. Thus equipped for the combat, Perseus had no fear of encountering the dread Medusa of the snaky locks, and pressed forward eagerly on his journey. He had already inquired of Mercury the way to the Gorgon's cave, but the god could not direct him, and told him that he must find the Graeae and learn the way from them. The Graeae were three hideous old women who had been gray haired from birth, and so received their name, and they lived in a far off land where eternal darkness reigned. They had only one tooth and one huge eye among them, and passed these around to each other in turn. As they alone could tell him where Medusa dwelt, Perseus started northward on Mercury's winged sandals, and after flying for many days in search of the three sisters, he came at last to their cheerless land. He found the gray old women seated under a drooping willow tree that fell so far over them that it almost hid their shrunken forms. There sat the crones that had the single eye, clad in blue sweeping cloak and snow white gown, while o'er their backs their straight white hair hung down in long thin locks. Dreadful their faces were, carved all about with wrinkles of despair, and as they sat they crooned a dreary song, complaining that their lives should last so long, in that sad place that no one came anear, in that one place desert of hope and fear. And singing still they rocked their bodies bent, and ever each to each the eye they sent. William Morris, The Doom of King Acrisius. As Perseus approached the spot where the gray old women sat crooning to themselves, he took great care to keep on his magic helmet, and he watched closely to see when the eye was being transferred from one old head to the other. Just as the eldest sister was taking out the great eye, and the one who was next in turn was holding out her shriveled hand to receive it, Perseus stepped quickly between them and snatched it away. The old woman began to grope for it in her pitiable blindness, and then arose a fierce dispute among the sisters as to who really had the eye. To end the quarreling, Perseus spoke gently to them, telling them that he had taken their treasured eye and would return it to them as soon as they had informed him where to find Medusa of the snaky locks. For a while the gray old women pretended that they had never heard of Medusa, but finding that the unseen speaker was determined to keep their precious eye until he had received the desired information, they told him the way to the Gorgon's cave. Perseus then returned to them the huge eye, which seemed to stare at him with a very knowing look, and sped off on his winged sandals to the country where Medusa dwelt. As he flew along the seacoast, he saw in the distance a dark cavern among the rocks, and in front of it, on the glaring white sand, lay a monster, which, even from his great height above the water, Perseus could not glance at without shuddering. Remembering Minerva's caution when she gave him her shield, he used its bright surface as a mirror in which were reflected all the objects below, and never once was he tempted to turn his eyes toward the dreadful figure on the beach. Its scaly hide glistened in the sunlight, its brazen claws shone like live coals, and the snakes that lay coiled about its head shot out their tongues and hissed whenever the Gorgon stirred in its sleep. As Perseus drew nearer, he saw reflected in his polished shield the forms of men and animals that had been turned to stone by one glance at Medusa's face. These were very numerous around the mouth of the cave, and Perseus silently prayed to the gods that his figure might not be added to the number. Some distance away lay the other two Gorgons, Medusa's sisters, but the young hero had no thought for them. His whole attention was centered on the blow that he must deal the sleeping Medusa before the snakes hissed so loudly that she would awaken. Even in his shield, the sight of that twisting, wriggling mass of reptiles was so repulsive that Perseus shuddered and was tempted to turn away. But just then he heard a whisper, Be quick, strike swift and sure." And as he recognized the voice of Mercury, all his courage returned. Grasping his sword more firmly and holding his bright shield above the sleeping monster, he swooped suddenly down upon it, and with one swift stroke cut off the great head with all its coils of serpents. It was only a moment's work to sheathe his sword and grasp the hideous trophy in his hands, but even then the danger was not over, for the snakes on Medusa's head began to hiss so loudly that their noise awoke the other two sleeping Gorgons, and they looked round to find why their sister had disturbed their rest. Seeing Medusa's headless body on the sand, they set up such terrible cries that the noise re-echoed like thunder through the cavern, and as far away as Perseus had already flown, he could hear the awful sounds that made the seashore seem like some vision in a dreadful nightmare. As he hurried over the sea with Medusa's head held firmly in his hand, some of the blood dripped down into the white-capped waves, and was cherished by Neptune, who had once loved Medusa when she was a beautiful maiden. From these drops of blood the Sea King created the wonderful winged horse Pegasus, who was to share the adventures of another famous hero, Bellerophon. Some of the Gorgon's blood had also dropped on the hot African sand as Perseus was flying upward from the Gorgon's cave, and from this sprang a brood of poisonous reptiles that ever afterward infested that region and brought death to many an unwary explorer. The journey homeward was long and wearisome, and Perseus was often obliged to seek the seashore to rest. Once, as he was flying along the coast of Africa, borne aloft on the winged sandals, he saw old Atlas standing where he had stood for many centuries, with the weight of the heavens on his bent shoulders. The clouds wrapped his head so completely that Perseus could see only his immense body. Forests had grown up so high all around him that his huge legs were scarcely visible among the heavy foliage, and his broad shoulders looked like mighty boulders rising up above the tree tops. But though his head was so far in the clouds, Atlas knew that Perseus was approaching, for giants have certain senses unpossessed by mortal men, and he shook the clouds from about his face and blew away the mists with his breath. Then, when the air was clear, and Perseus could see the white hair that was previously hidden above the clouds, he pitied poor Atlas for his heavy punishment, and stopped to speak with him. The giant looked down from his great height and begged the hero to uncover Medusa's head, which Perseus had kept wrapped in his cloak, for he was anxious to gaze upon it and become himself an image of stone. He told how weary he was of standing for all these ages without ever being able to rest, and he could not endure the thought of keeping up this torture for eternity. So Perseus lifted up the Gorgon's head, being careful to keep his own averted, and Atlas gazed long and eagerly at the dead face with its wreath of lifeless serpents. Then slowly the giant's great bulk began to harden, and the stooping shoulders became firm, unfeeling stone. As Perseus stood there watching this strange transformation, he seemed to see no longer the floating white hair of Atlas, but a pile of snow on a mountain top, and he looked no more on the huge limbs surrounded by forests, but he saw rents and clefts on a mountain side that just showed themselves through the thick trees. Thus was the burden of Atlas forever removed from his aching shoulders, and the heavens now rested securely on a mountain. When Perseus resumed his journey along the coast, he soon came to a place where the cliffs rose abruptly from the sea, and as he looked down at the rocks below him, he saw, outlined against their dark surface, a figure that made him pause in his swift flight and wonder if a sudden madness had taken hold of his fancy, for chained to the rock was a maiden so beautiful that even her constant weeping had not marred the perfect loveliness of her face. Keeping the Gorgon's head carefully concealed under his cloak, so that the captive maiden could get no glimpse of the snaky locks, Perseus flew to the girl's side, and taking off his magic helmet, spoke to her gently. At any other time she would have been startled at this sudden appearance of a stranger, but the thought of her dreadful fate, so near at hand, drove all other fears from her mind. The spray from the sea dashed over her, and the cold winds blew on her shivering form, but of this she seemed to be hardly aware. Her eyes were fixed in wild terror upon a cavern in the rocks, where Perseus could see a huge dragon lying stretched out on the cool, slimy seaweed. When the young hero spoke to the maiden, she did not seem to hear him, but at his gentle persistence she at last turned her eyes away from the dreaded cavern, and told him her story. She said that her name was Andromeda, and that her mother Cassiopeia had angered the sea nymphs by presuming to rival them in beauty. To punish the queen for her vanity, the nymphs sent a fierce sea monster to devastate the homes along the coast, and when the terrified people consulted an oracle to know how they might save themselves from further disaster, they were told that the monster would not depart until the Princess Andromeda was sacrificed to its fury. So the king, her father, and her wretched, remorseful mother, and a procession of weeping attendants had led her that very day to the rocks, and had chained her fast to await the monster's pleasure. Just as Andromeda was speaking, there was a rustling sound in the cave, as if the dragon were stretching its huge wings. Then came a sudden whir and a rush as the monster glided out of the dim interior of its cave and came speeding through the water towards its victim. The scaly hide glittered in the sunlight, and the great coils of its snaky body beat up the waves as it came with incredible swiftness towards the captive maiden, whose terrified shrieks almost unnerved the young hero who had come to rescue her. Quickly he donned his magic helmet and grasped the keen-edged sword that had already stood him in good stead. As the monster's head emerged from the waves, Perseus rushed upon it unseen, and with a quick thrust pierced the creature in its one vital spot. The dragon sank back into the blood-stained water, and then made a few ineffective plunges towards its victim, but Perseus's blow had been sure, and the creature's great body finally disappeared beneath the waves. While Andromeda was thanking her deliverer with grateful tears, he struck off the chains that bound her to the rock, and led her to where her parents and an astonished group of watchers had been looking on at the strange combat. The great joy of Andromeda's father was equaled only by the mother's happiness over her rescued child, and they both welcomed the young hero who had saved her from so terrible a fate. When Perseus had been entertained royally for several days, the king bade him demand any reward that he wished for his heroic services, and the youth boldly asked Andromeda's hand in marriage. To this the parents gladly consented, although she was already betrothed to her uncle Phineus, and the preparations were begun at once for the wedding. While the marriage celebrations were in progress, the jilted suitor, who had been too timid to attempt any rescue of Andromeda, now came forward to claim his wife. His pretensions were laughed at, however, and he left the court angry and plotting revenge. The following day he appeared with a band of followers and suddenly attacked Perseus, who had barely time to defend himself. The friends of the young hero rallied to his support, but they were outnumbered by the attacking party, and the disastrous battle might have ensued had not Perseus bethought himself of a sure means of defense. Catching up the cloak in which he had wrapped the Gorgon's head, he cried, "Whoever is my friend, let him turn away his eyes." The courtiers of King Cepheus and the men fighting around Perseus obeyed him, but Phineus and his followers believed this to be a mere trick to gain time, and looked on while Perseus unveiled Medusa's snaky head. Some of the gazers had their spears in uplifted hands, some were fitting arrows to their bows as they turned their eyes for a moment towards Perseus. But in whatever position they stood, just so they were suddenly turned into stone. By some chance Phineus had been watching his men instead of looking on the Gorgon's head, and when he saw their dreadful transformation, he fell on his knees before Perseus and with outstretched hands implored the hero to spare his life. But Perseus forced him to look upon the hideous face of Medusa, and he became a stone image with averted head and supplicating arms. Having thus disposed effectively of his enemies, Perseus covered up his death-dealing trophy, and the wedding ceremonies were resumed. Later he departed with his bride to the country of Polydectes, where that king had been keeping his mother a prisoner until she would consent to marry him. He had long ago believed Perseus dead, and was therefore much astonished to see him appear unharmed and victorious. Hearing of the cruel treatment his mother had received from Polydectes, the young hero determined on a swift revenge. In the presence of the king and his court he suddenly displayed the head of Medusa, and the whole company, just as they stood, were turned into stone. Then Perseus set sail with his wife and mother for his own country, but before he left he returned to Pluto the magic helmet, to Mercury the winged sandals, and to Minerva the wonderful Aegis. The august goddess of wisdom seemed to have taken a strange fancy to the Gorgon's head, so Perseus gave her this trophy of his victory, and she fixed it in the middle of her shield. When Perseus, with Andromeda and Danaë, arrived in Argo, they found that old Acrisius had been driven from his throne, and that a usurper was enjoying the kingdom. It did not take long for the hero who had slain Medusa to kill the unlawful claimant and reinstate his grandfather. The old man had been languishing for years in prison, and was hardly able to endure the great joy of his release at the hands of one whom he had long since believed to be dead. Things seemed to be settled very happily in spite of the oracle, but the decrees of the gods are sure to be fulfilled, and one day when Perseus was playing quoits, he accidentally threw one wide of the mark. It struck Acrisius, who was looking on at the game, and killed him instantly. This unfortunate mishap so preyed upon Perseus's mind that he could not remain in Argo, but exchanged his kingdom for that of Mycenae, over which he ruled for many years very wisely and well. When at last Perseus died, the gods placed him among the stars with his wife Andromeda and with Cassiopeia, who had long since been cured of her vanity. End of chapter 25.